that night. I never wanted to remember it again, but now that I've finally started leading a somewhat normal life, I feel like I can talk about it. I've been undergoing psychological therapy for a long time. Because of what I experienced, I developed deep phobias. You could call it severe trauma. Anyway, without making this too long, it was August 2019. If you're wondering how I remember it so clearly, it was my cousin's birthday. Since it wasn't going to be a huge, overcrowded party, I went there alone. Around that time, my uncle, who was going through a terrible patch in his life, had been staying with my aunt for a few weeks. He had divorced his wife a few months prior, and his mental state was completely shattered. More than half of his income went into alimony. He had resigned from his job, and since he was dead broke, he started crashing at their place. After a half-hour drive, I reached my aunt's house. It was around 6 p.m. I rang the bell, and after a few minutes, my older cousin opened the door. I hadn't expected to see him, but it had been a long time, and our bond had never changed. We hugged immediately and started catching up. My aunt was in the kitchen preparing food for the birthday party. The scent of those freshly baked cookies is still stuck in my nose. My cousin called out to me, "Come on, come help me, my mom is almost done." I turned toward his voice and saw my other uncle out in the backyard. He was setting up the outdoor lighting since it would be pitch black later. I went over, greeted him, and we hugged. My divorced uncle was sitting alone at one of the tables, smoking a cigarette. I walked up to him and asked how he was doing. He answered in a completely flat, lifeless tone. I felt so sorry for him. The divorce hadn't been his choice. Since my younger cousin mentioned he would also celebrate with his friends after school, we prepared for the evening at a relaxed pace. I was getting bored of waiting, and it was past 8 p.m. when the doorbell finally rang. Long story short, my cousin had a great time. Since it was getting late and I genuinely loved spending time with them, I decided to stay over that night. Around midnight, we were all sitting around, everyone staring blankly at the walls out of pure exhaustion. My aunt had already gone to bed. Suddenly, my uncle turned around and asked, "Have any of you ever gone treasure hunting?" We started talking about it, and he added that there was an unearned, cursed treasure nearby that nobody had ever been able to dig up. Before we knew it, we found ourselves out on the road. My younger cousin, saying he had to wake up early for school and that it had been a long, exhausting day, decided to lay down and stay behind. So, my older cousin, my two uncles, and I drove for about 2 hours. Finally, we reached the site. It was a vast, open wasteland surrounded by towering, ominous trees. I stepped out of the car with a sense of dread. My uncle pointed to the spot where we were supposed to dig. We started digging with shovels and pickaxes for nearly an hour, but it felt like the dirt we dug up was somehow filling itself back in. We were making absolutely no progress. At one point, my cousin turned to me and whispered, "Do you hear that too?" I looked at him. His eyes were wide with pure shock and terror. What do you mean?" I asked, frightened. "They are telling me to get out of here. They're telling me not to dig up this place," he said. "Haven't you noticed? We've been digging for an hour and there's no progress at all. This place is making me sick. Let's make up an excuse and leave." I asked him, "Why don't you tell my dad and my uncle?" He replied, "If I tell my dad, he'll just pass it on to my uncle. The man's mental state is already broken. It's better if he doesn't know." I agreed, "All right, let's go." I turned around. My uncles were about 15 to 20 meters away from us. My divorced uncle had walked off to smoke another cigarette, and my other uncle, exhausted from digging, had gone over to talk to him. They had been chatting there for a while. I turned and started walking toward the car, but I realized I couldn't hear my cousin's footsteps behind me. After walking a few meters, I felt a knot in my stomach and looked back. My cousin was standing there, clutching the shovel tightly, completely catatonic. His consciousness was entirely gone. I was too terrified to even step closer to him. Tears were streaming down his face. I immediately screamed for my uncles and they came running over. They grabbed my cousin and started shaking him violently. His eyes were wide open, but he was completely unresponsive. Right then, the wind began to howl, picking up speed aggressively. I was so terrified I almost ran to the car to lock myself inside. Finally, my cousin let go of the shovel and collapsed to the ground. My uncles grabbed him by his arms and dragged his limp body toward the car. We got in and started speeding back to the house. My mind was racing. What kind of place was that? How was the dirt filling itself back in? And why was my cousin the only one hearing those voices? Just as we were pulling up to the house, my cousin finally snapped out of it, but he claimed he had absolutely no memory of what had just happened. The rest of the night passed without incident. We went to our beds and nobody uttered a single word about what we had witnessed. The next morning, after having breakfast, since my younger cousin had gone to school and the atmosphere in the house felt incredibly suffocating, I decided to go back to my own home. Right after I arrived, my parents packed up and left, telling me they were going away for a few days to spend some quiet time together. I was actually glad to be left alone. I sat down at my computer and played video games for hours. Eventually, I stopped just staring blankly at the screen when I suddenly heard a scratching sound. It sounded like someone dragging long fingernails across the walls. A freezing shiver ran down my spine. I shattered down the computer immediately. I grabbed a knife from my collection in my bedroom and began patrolling the house. I checked every single room one by one. A voice inside my head kept screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to believe it was nothing, that the sound was coming from outside. Walking through those dark corridors, reaching out my hand to turn on the lights of pitch-black rooms, made me incredibly tense. It felt like something was going to grab my hand from the darkness. Fortunately, nothing did. I went back to my room, but this time, I heard the scratching sound much louder and closer than before. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of the house. I ran all the way to my uncle's house. Of course, I couldn't tell them the truth. If I showed up at their doorstep in the middle of the night saying, I heard scratching sounds and got scared, they would think I was losing my mind. I had to concoct a lie on the spot. I told them, I forgot my phone charger here and I need to set my alarm to wake up early tomorrow morning. I wouldn't have come at this hour if it wasn't important. They immediately let me inside. They obviously weren't going to send me back home at that time of night anyway. My younger cousin was already fast asleep, so to avoid waking him up, I went into my older cousin's room. The lights were off, but his eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. I lay down on the couch to the right of his bed. A few minutes later, I started hearing those exact same scratching sounds in this room too. I looked at my cousin. He was still lying there in the exact same position, paralyzed. Then, out of the deep shadows of the room, a dark silhouette began to manifest. My blood turned to ice. I desperately reached out to my cousin and started shaking him, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that shadow. I felt like if I blinked or looked away for a single second, it would pounce on me. Despite how hard I was shaking him, it took him a painfully long time to respond. When I finally glanced at his face, tears were pouring from his eyes. He whispered, "It has been following me for 2 days. It's constantly watching me." I felt like my very soul was being drained. "I'm going to turn on the light," I said. I stood up and moved away from my cousin's bed, stepping directly toward the area where that thing was watching us. It stood right in front of me, completely motionless, staring back. I knew that if I showed my fear, it would terrorize me even more, so I forced myself to walk with determined steps toward the light switch. But the closer I got, the more my spirit drained. I was on the verge of screaming, but somehow my legs brought me right to the switch. I reached out to turn on the light and I completely froze. I couldn't move. It was standing right in front of me. It was terrifyingly tall, looking down into my very soul. My legs were locked. I was stiff as a corpse. It was barely 5 meters away from me. Suddenly, my cousin started screaming my name, snapping me out of the trance. The exact second I flipped the switch and the light flooded the room, it vanished into thin air. Once the initial shock wore off, we woke up the family and explained everything. We decided that early the next morning, we would visit a renowned spiritual healer. I couldn't sleep a single wink that night. My cousin and I just sat up talking. Early in the morning, we woke up my uncle and hit the road. The moment we arrived at the healer's place, before we could even introduce ourselves, the old man spoke our names out loud. He pointed at my cousin and me saying, "And, stay inside. Everyone else, leave the room." He asked us to sit cross-legged on the floor facing each other. My cousin sat directly in front of me. The healer walked over and covered both of us with a heavy, dark cloth. "No matter what you hear, do not uncover yourselves," he warned sternly. Terrified, I shut my eyes tight under the darkness of the fabric. I could only rely on my hearing. Suddenly, the healer's voice distorted completely, and he began chanting and speaking in an unrecognizable tongue. I wondered if he was speaking to us, but then, another voice began to answer him. There was nobody else in that room except for me, my cousin, and the healer. The healer's voice grew louder, turning into a heated, aggressive argument with this unseen presence. The entity sounded furious, listening to the healer and breathing heavily, snorting in rage. Finally, the healer spoke to us in his normal voice, "You can uncover yourselves now, children." I had become so deeply paranoid that I briefly wondered if it was actually the entity tricking us using the healer's voice, but my cousin was already throwing the cloth off his head. Afterward, the healer sat us down and explained everything. He told us that we had disturbed their sacred hidden treasure. They had warned us to back off, but we had insisted on digging. Because of that, they wanted to punish us. Since my uncles hadn't done much of the actual digging, the entities left them alone. The healer made us swear a solemn oath that we would never again trespass on their territory, touch their belongings, or interfere with their world. He recited several protective prayers over us and handed each of us a protective amulet to wear at all times. I never experienced anything paranormal after that day, but it took me long, painful years to finally overcome the trauma.